Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be expanding in a way on a topic that I started talking about 2 weeks ago, and namely that is the other side of our usage of typology. Generally speaking, I talk a lot about types, cognitive functions, Enneagram types, different MBTI Enneagram combinations, and so on and so forth. But I feel like also kind of adding to my general content by also discussing topics that make us think about typology critically as well. So, different issues that might arise with using typology and things we might need to be careful with. So, more specifically, I'm going to be discussing about the gap between understanding or perception and observation. So all about that in the next few minutes. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, I'll be adding a link in the description of this video. The link is basically my Linktree account, so you'll get the chance to explore different areas such as my website and the coaching and training services that I provide on a variety of topics, my newsletter, my Instagram page, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to check the link in the description below. Anyway, let's get back to business. So I was talking about how there is a gap between our understanding, perception, and our observation of something in ourselves or in other people. I agree with the fact that it's important to try to be aligned with each other when we describe functions and types and temperaments and Enneagram types and so on and so forth, so that we have a common language, we have a common understanding of things, and so that consequently we can, use it for purposes that could be adapted across contexts. So let's say that, if I talk about extroverted thinking and someone else talks about extroverted thinking, we're mainly referring to the same thing. So even though I agree this is important, I also acknowledge the fact that at this point in time, that is not really the case. And not because people are bad or not because people are incompetent or they don't understand what they're talking about, namely because typology, and now I'm referring specifically to the Jungian typology or to the MBTI system or the cognitive functions or the archetype model, whatever you might want to call it. The problem is that there are a lot of different angles that we use to look at this particular topic. For example, we have the original Jungian description of the 8 cognitive functions. We also have John Beebe's interpretation of the 8-function model, which of course has a significant degree of overlap with Jung, but it's not entirely the same. Then we have the actual MBTI model. Then we have David Kurz's temperament model that looks at types from a different lens. We have socionics as well, and others. Interaction style model by Linda Burns. And because there are so many different lenses, even though we try to align ourselves and use similar language or have a similar understanding of the types and the functions and the temperaments, sometimes there are significant inconsistencies. You will notice that, for example, Jung's original work focuses much more on the conceptual understanding of the functions and much less on the behavior. But if you look at David Kersey, you will also notice that a lot or a great deal of his descriptions also try to pinpoint several behavioral inputs or behavioral coordinates to kind of make it easier to measure. Because this is a criticism that modern psychology and science gives to MBTI or, similar systems, and that is the fact that it's more difficult to measure in a practical way because it talks more about how people think and process information rather than about specific behavior. If you've been following me for a while, you probably know, and you've probably noticed, I'm more aligned with the part of typology that talks about functions as abstract processes, mental processes that are not necessarily, not that they're not linked with behavioral inputs, but I don't like describing functions by describing behavior. Yes, they do influence behavior to an extent, but there are too many other factors that come into play that influence behavior in the end. However, I'm not saying that other ways of looking at typology are not valid or are not interesting. I love different angles of looking at things. The problem is that we forget about these differences. We forget that sometimes the definition is not the same, and then we might, try to convince each other of our own opinion, even when that might just be that, an opinion. And it's okay. It's okay to have a different opinion. It's okay to look at things differently. But if we don't even define things in the same way, then it's very likely that the output is not going to be the same one. The other part is this definition gap aspect. So even if, let's say, we agree on a definition that this particular function has this definition, or, this type has this particular description or whatever. The problem is that when we try to apply this in our lives and type other people, for example, especially people that we don't know, like movie characters or like celebrities or people that we interact with like very little, we very often fall into the trap of thinking that the way we apply the concepts in the real world is the correct way to apply those concepts into the real world. But someone else might come and say, well, yes, I agree with you. This is a definition of, introverted feeling, for example. But I don't think this person is exhibiting introverted feeling right now. Even though we have the same definition and we're looking at the same thing or the same person or the same behavior or the same speech pattern or whatever, my understanding or my interpretation of what's going on might say, well, yes, this is the person showing that they have a strong preference for introverted feeling. Whereas you might say, well, no, I agree with you on the definition. I'm seeing the same thing, but I'm interpreting it differently. I think this is actually a sign of introverted thinking or extroverted feeling or whatever. And that's because that's a current weakness of the system. It's very hard to pinpoint specifically in terms of behaviors, speech patterns, outward expressions, what exactly it is that we're looking at. So, in my opinion, a more valuable, insightful, and helpful way to look at things is to try to look at a person holistically, how they are across contexts, what kind of patterns occur repeatedly. To also talk to the person and ask them questions and ask how they also feel about themselves, what's going on in their own minds, what patterns they are identifying there. Of course, this is not a foolproof method. It's not 100% accurate. But what does it even mean to be accurate? How do we measure accuracy? How do we know that this is accurate or not? According to whose definition, according to whose standard? So I guess the aim of me making this video is to encourage you to think about these things in a bit of a more big picture, or from a big picture perspective, and say, we know these things, we understand these things about the functions, about the types, about the temperaments, about the interaction styles, about the Enneagram. And there are certain things that we can notice in other people that seem to match with these descriptions, but we are far from having a very easy method that we can all use to measure these things in other people and to really be on the same page. So let's try to use typology in a way that is empowering, in a way that really helps us understand ourselves, gain more insight into who we are, what comes naturally to us and what doesn't, what feels natural and what doesn't feel so natural, what comes easy and what comes more difficult to us. Let's also use typology in a way that helps us have more tolerance and respect for other people and the differences that they exhibit, in a way that enables us to have more empathy with each other, in a way that helps us communicate better with each other because we acknowledge the differences and we don't take it personally always that someone communicates in a different way than us or someone behaves in a way that is different than what we expect. And let's be humble and remember that there's still a long way to go until we have a very easy to measure objective system that we can then argue about. That's my take on it. I highly believe this. I am a very strong supporter of this idea. And I will probably make some more videos looking at other perspectives or angles that we might need to take into account when, dealing with this topic, when trying to apply this topic, and so on and so forth. So anyway, thanks a lot for watching this video. Thanks a lot for being with me, and see you next time with another video on typology.